Good evening and welcome to CJC Today with your co-host Edward Woods III and Christian Josiah. Christian Josiah is the great Chief Operating Officer and Vice President of Administration for the Central States Conference, but today he is known as the Public Affairs and Religious Liberty Director and the CJC Secretary. I'm Edward Woods III. Happy to be here. I'm the Public Affairs and Religious Liberty for Lake Region and the chairperson for the Conscience and Justice Council. And we are excited. We are excited about the panel that we have tonight.
Yes,
and although it's bittersweet, we praise God that each and every one of them are with us this evening. Please invite your friends, tell your neighbors that the CJC is on, send them a text, share on Facebook or YouTube about what's taking place with this panel discussion. Where do we go from here? A speech given by Dr. Martin Luther King. Dr. Josiah, we're going to go ahead and let you introduce the guests you have, and then I will do an introduction for the great Lisa Clark Diller.
All right. Well, this evening we are blessed to have some great panelists who are with us. I'm going to start, ladies, first with Dr. Olive Hemmings, who is a professor at Washington Adventist University there on the East Coast. She has been teaching in Seventh-day Adventist higher education since 1982. Began teaching at her alma mater, West Indies College, and has earned degrees in New Testament and biblical language from the Andrews University Seminary, and she's also a PhD in theology, ethics, and culture from Claremont. We are glad to have her here with us this evening. Dr. Olive Hemmings, how are you doing this evening?
Just great to be feeling good to be in this great company. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being with us. Edward Woods III, you want to introduce Dr. Lisa?
We're going to, sure. It's not very often you get a professor in the history department of Southern Adventist University who by right is also a Southern scholar. So when you're looking at greatness, you're looking at greatness that not only matriculated, but now is giving back to students at Southern University in Collegedale, Tennessee. If you have never seen Lisa Clark Diller on film, don't let the smile fool you. She is not afraid in speaking truth to power and making sure that the gospel is unadulterated. And it's just very fascinating for those who may have experienced her as she uses her history and her political science. She always makes sure that she never loses her Christianity. In other words, her Christianity is the priority in her life. And so although I have witnessed her from afar, we are honored and privileged to have someone of her caliber with us today, along with our other esteemed guests. So ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome the legendary Dr. Lisa Clark Diller from Southern Adventist University.
It's fun to be here. Thanks so much for having me on this Friday evening.
Amen. Glad to have you. Next week up, we have Dr. Nicholas Miller from the Andrews University. And he is, let me just read his bio, what I have. He has a BA in theology from Pacific Union College. He has a JD from Columbia University Law School, where he was a Stone Scholar and an editor of the Columbia Law Review. He has a PhD in American Religious and Legal History from the University of Notre Dame. And you will find out later on why that is so important. He has argued many church-state cases in state and federal courts and has appeared before the U.S. Supreme Court in the case of Mitchell versus Helms. He's an author. He's a scholar. He's a professional. I'm just glad to be in his company, and we're glad that he could join us tonight. He has a book on the development of religious freedom in America. It's called The Religious Roots of the First Amendment, which was published by the Oxford University Press in the summer of 2012. And Dr. Miller, man, we are just glad to have you with us once again in the Conscience and Justice Council space tonight.
Great. It's always good to be with the dynamic duo of Brother Edward Woods and Pastor Christian Josiah, and tonight will be no different. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Last but not least, my friend, Dr. Tim Golden. I have his little bio here. I'll read it, but I'm gonna say something a little later on that might take a few people off. But it's the Sabbath. I won't go into it. Dr. Golden, Tim Golden is a professor of philosophy, legal studies program coordinator, and director of the Donald Blake Center for the Study of Race, Ethnicity, and Culture at the Walla Walla University. For 20 years, he was a criminal defense attorney in the city, here it is, of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Fly, Eagles, fly. He is the author of Frederick Douglass and the Philosophy of Religion and Subjectivity, Transcendence, and the Problem of Ontotheology. Dr. Tim Golden, man, we are glad to have you in this space on the Sabbath, on a Friday night. So I will make sure that I keep the Sabbath and not go into anything pertaining to that lovely city from which you hail. Glad to have you, my brother.
I'm gonna let that slide, Josiah.
Let it slide. Let it slide.
And Tim knows why. I'm gonna let that slide, man.
Well, I know why too.
Anybody that knows me, it's all about the stars, but I'm gonna let that slide because it's the Sabbath. And we want everybody to come back. But Tim, Amen. Come off mute because I know you got something to say. I'm not gonna cheat you, my brother.
Yes, sir. Well, I'm going to let a lot of things slide too. Pastor Josiah and Woody, I want to thank you all for this invitation. As I want to echo Dr. Hemmings and say what a joy it is to be in such august company among my fellow Adventist scholars and pedagogues as we work through the issues in higher education. It's nice to come aside and be together to discuss issues like those on the table tonight. So my thanks to all of you for inviting me and for having me here to discuss these very important topics. So I'm blessed to be here, and it's great to see my fellow panelists who are colleagues who I know and love. So thank you all.
Okay, now we're here to talk about where do we go from here? Martin Luther King's speech, chaos or community. And what we wanted to talk about in the lens of coming out of the pandemics that took place 3 years ago. I know COVID is still around, but they were known as the triple pandemics of COVID-19, systemic racism, and economic uncertainty. And we know about 60 years ago, Dr. King came out with this speech during the height of the civil rights era. And if you look at it when he spoke 60 years ago and looking at it 60 years ago where he spoke about the speech, where do we go from here? And then moving forward about 60 years later, coming out of the pandemic, where do we go from here? People have different and varying opinions on COVID-19. People have different and varying opinions on critical race theory and systemic racism. People have different and various opinions on how we should deal with economic uncertainty. And so this is just a discussion with regards to that. If you're in the audience and you have questions with regards to that, we will take them. But this is the main thing we're going to discuss. We're going to give each one of our panelists an opportunity to respond. And then after that, it's open to the audience. I mean, this is how we roll. We want to hear from the audience. We want this to be engaging. And I will put the information on the screen. And Dr. Josiah will go ahead and read those questions and give them to the panelists. But right now, we're just going to open it up to the panelists, knowing the context of Dr. King's speech of where do we go from here, and knowing the context of what we've come out of with regard to the pandemics 60 years later. The question here before each and every one of our panelists is, where do we go from here? Now that you kind of know, who wants to go first? We don't always have to say ladies first, because sometimes ladies might not want to go first. Sometimes men So whoever wants to take a stab at it, go ahead.
Not all at the same time.
Well, I guess I'll give it a try here. I think when I think about the Dr. King celebration this weekend and I consider his birthday, I am reminded of how in 1986, President Reagan signed legislation that made Dr. King's birthday a national holiday. But I'm also reminded that at the same time he signed that legislation to make Dr. King's birthday a national holiday, the federal sentencing guidelines and President Reagan's criminal justice policy was beginning the process of what today has been known as mass incarceration. And over the past 30 plus years, from 1985 going forward, the proliferation of mandatory minimum sentencing laws and the federal sentencing guidelines, which were just recently, about 13 years ago, declared discretionary in a case called United States versus Booker, even as the black community in the United States and others celebrated that Dr. King's birthday was now a federal holiday, there were policies at work that would end up crippling the black community for decades to come. And here we are in 2023, and we are celebrating Dr. King's birthday on Monday. And as we prepare to celebrate his birthday, there's still no policy outcomes from the murder of George Floyd. The George Floyd Justice and Policing Act still has not made it to President Biden's desk. President Biden has not signed it. And the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act still has not made it to President Biden's desk. And on Monday, we will celebrate the life and legacy of Dr. King in what I think will be a somewhat diluted manner, because there's a difference between movements and monuments. Monuments are places that movements go to die. And even as we are rejoicing over the life and legacy of King, I think we have truncated that legacy somewhat, because when his birthday became a national holiday, we turned it over to the national consciousness, and we now celebrate it with a national ethos that is very different from the ethos that you hear in Dr. King's speech the night before he was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. I want to urge everyone to go and listen to that speech, because I think if you do, you will realize that the radical nature of Dr. King's politics on April 3rd, 1968 is not what we will be celebrating on Monday. We will be celebrating something on Monday very different. That's not to say that we shouldn't celebrate Dr. King's legacy. We absolutely should. But if we're going to celebrate his legacy, let's celebrate it in its totality and not just celebrate those things that maintain the status quo and prevent us from feeling uncomfortable. So where do we go from here? I hope we go to a place where we don't just remember history, but where we remember it with an eye toward making sure that what happened once never happens again.
That's good. That's really good. That's really good. Good perspective. Anybody else? Anybody else wants to weigh in?
I read through the speech a little bit, skimmed it, trying to remind myself of the themes. Where do we go from here? That Dr. King gave us, historians like their primary texts. And I just kind of wanted to be reminded of that. And I think he felt very similarly to how we feel now. Like, okay, something that some people might want to call progress may have happened. Also, there's a whole bunch of other things, like you didn't even know whether to completely say, is the pandemic over or not? Like we're not, it's here and, yet it's like the kingdom of heaven, that's not yet and yet here. So we feel that way. And I think he did too. And the two things that he really talked about that I thought were, the strategic things that he said we need to do from here. One that was most important, and I think in the face of the first two elements especially, but maybe all three of them, is that we need to take the dignity of human beings really seriously. We need to preserve our dignity, preserve who we are as people, be reminded that we are, we have dignity. And he was talking to his fellow Black Americans specifically in that speech, and the language he uses is for that. And for sure, we want to think about that on this day of all days. I think the reminder that of all the humans who died, like the bodies who needed care and the people who cared for them. I've been reminded of how fragile we are and how important it is to see humans and their dignity and to care for them, especially I think our dignity in dying. So many people with COVID-19 dying alone and how tragic that was. And I was just sharing with my colleagues here that my aunt passed away this week, and our greatest prayer was that she would not die alone. And the Lord helped make that possible, that she died with her daughter there massaging her. What a wonderful thing, to get to pass away cared for. So the dignity of humans. And so I think economics, health, justice, when it comes, especially the Black Lives Matter movement, reminding us of particular people whose justice and dignity matters. That we need to focus kind of on that. And then his second element that he said that would help us go is there needed to be organization, an organization around politics and power. And he had a lot to say about the proper and improper uses of power, and he backed it up with reminding everyone that he still believed in nonviolence. It is very hard not to be violent when organizing oneself for power. I think, my idea is I'm pretty sure I know what people need to do, and I want to grab them by the scruff of the neck and haul them off to do what I want them to do. I get violent the more right I think I am. Sometimes I want to be more violent. And so he was very wise about how he talked about that. And yet something had to be done. And then the final thing that really stood out to me was his call for us to be born again. That this is what we need more than anything else, is for our hearts to be born again. So I think in the face of all of the horror that has happened in so many ways over the last 60 years, but let's just say in the face of these pandemics, it is really easy to have tragedy fatigue, to calcify our hearts a little bit, because it's just hard to keep caring and keep caring and keep caring. And I personally know I need to be born again so that my heart is soft towards other people and to the call that is needed for people who need economic justice and racial justice and health justice.
Very good. Thank you so much.
Well, let Nick have the last say on this, because he's well versed in thinking through these. But let me say, when we ask the question, where do we go from here today in 2023, January 2023, there's an elephant in the room, a big question. What more do Black people want? Look how many laws and policies have been made to make sure they move ahead, And I've heard these statements myself from others. And yet, the George Floyd incident, and there were many like that before, it's just that one was caught on tape, tells us that regardless of whatever laws and policies that have been put in place to protect the rights of Black people, to affirm Black people and make sure that they get a fair slice of the pie, that there is still a problem, because you can change laws, but you can't change people's minds and their hearts. And when MLK talk about, though you speak with the tongues of men of angels, though you have great institutions, whatnot, and you do not have love, it profits nothing. Now, some people might think, oh, this is not conversation for the public sphere. But listen, Christianity, the church, is now part of the public conversation. They're in Congress, they're in the Supreme Court, they're everywhere. And if we are not seeing the church taking this part now, the church needs to take up a great part of this question of where do we go from here as far as the rights of Blacks and other disadvantaged persons. They now need to take up this big part that they have always dropped. Because even when rules and laws were being made to affirm Black people, to affirm their rights, and the church was the last to catch up. And so when the church continues to show some kind of apathy as far as their preaching and their proclamation towards the rights and dignities of Blacks and other disadvantaged people in this country, then it doesn't matter how many rules and laws and policies we make, we'll be like it would be like it is as though we're on a treadmill, you know. We're going, but we're not. We're going pretty fast, but we're not going anywhere. And so, yes, there are policies. We've come a long way from 60 years ago, but somehow things have changed. But it would seem that as far as our consciousness, as far as the consciousness of this nation, things remain the same. And I think we need to now go inside. And the church is the one that needs to take us there. This is where the church needs to take us from here. To change of hearts and change of minds. We can discuss this further. How do we do that? How does the church really becomes a champion for human rights rather than simply trying to defend itself against human rights? And some people know what I'm talking about.
Yes,
How do we become a champion?
We're gonna definitely take it from there, Dr. Hammonds, as a church. But Dr. Miller, go ahead and weigh in on the opening question for us.
I mean, just so many important insights have been shared, and I especially like the way that Dr. Hemmings really, she put the paradox of the church, because she began by saying the church was behind playing catch up. But let's not forget, and as she concluded her remarks, she talked about the importance of the church leading out. And, you know, Martin Luther King Jr. was a clergyman. He was a pastor. He was leading not the whole church, but he was leading a very important part of the church. And as we look back in the 50s and 60s, the civil rights movement as we know it would not have happened without the leadership and involvement of Christian pastors, ministers, and congregations, right? It was the philosophy they put together that was a combination of scripture and thoughtful political commentary and insight that led to a movement that was assertive but nonviolent and was able to bring America along, if you will, and make the changes that they made. And so it is to the church, I think, that we have to look for a leadership role as we have come to a new phase in the struggle. You know, the pandemic, there's two types of judgments in the Bible. There's judgments that are retributive, that they give you what you deserve. But then there's other judgments which are revelatory, which help you see what you really are. Mm-hmm. And both the election of 2016 and then the pandemic revealed America as still a nation of great structural inequity, of racist inequality, of racial inequality that was seen in the disproportionate effects of the pandemic itself, that was seen in the protests that broke out after the fact. And it opened many of our eyes, probably more in the white community, because we were hopeful after Obama was elected that somehow, you know, racism was behind us. And, you know, why did this happen? Why were we able to elect Obama? And many Americans, if not most Americans, weren't personally opposed to electing a black man. And yet we have a society with such deep systemic racial injustice. And I think these words, and I have a confession to make. I've read a lot of Martin Luther King Jr., but I don't believe that I read this speech before Edward circulated it to us this weekend. Now, I read one like it. It's very similar to the speech he gave at the Riverside Church, also in 1967, where he famously attacked the evil trio of racism, militarism, and materialism. And in this speech, he really develops this notion of the economic system that perpetuates the injustices that are found across the racial divides. And I think he was so wise and insightful in seeing you could erase racism from individual hearts, but if this same economic system continued to be in place, just because the Black community was so far behind and so far on the margins economically, it would never catch up. And that this rebirth that Lisa referred us to, involve not just a kind of renewing of the mind in terms of the way we think about our fellow men and women, but also a renewing of our mind about how we think about what's fundamentally important to the system of what America is. And in my study of evangelicalism over the last 20 years, it's almost become an 11th commandment that the free enterprise, unrestrained capitalism is good, and to criticize it makes you a communist and not worthy of the American experiment. And as you read Dr. King, he clearly saw the problems with an unfettered capitalism that meant that any group that was poor would continue to stay poor, and that the gap between rich and poor would widen. And I would hesitate as a seminary professor to get into this area of economics and policy if it wasn't for my prophet, Ellen White, who wrote especially in Patriarchs and Prophets, if you're interested in looking up the chapters on the treatment of the poor, she goes into detail about the Jewish economic system and how it was set up to redistribute wealth every 7 years and every 49 years, and debts were forgiven and gleanings happened. And she describes a very robust system that wasn't communism, but it certainly wasn't capitalism. And it was an in-between road that Martin Luther King Jr. talks about in this speech. And I would urge our listeners to look this speech up and read it. Where do we go from here? And recognize that it reflects the thoughts of our own prophetic leadership written 100 years earlier. And as Adventists, we need to start thinking about social and economic issues in a way that is much closer to the biblical model than it is to the 20th and 21st century American capitalistic model that seems to have become a kind of commitment of much of evangelicalism. And if we don't address these problems, then this systemic racism is not going away. And it affects Blacks and it affects other poor groups, including poor whites in Appalachia and other parts of the country that are also engaged in ongoing systemic falling behind, if you will. So that's just some of my thoughts at this point.
That's good.
Pastor Josiah, if I could just interject here,
Yes.
Where do we go from here isn't just a speech of Dr. King's, it's also a book of Dr. King's. And the subtitle of the book is Chaos or Community. And one of his close confidants, Vincent Harding, wrote the foreword to that book. So it's great for us to read the speech, but I think Dr. King's expansion of those remarks into a full-blown book where he makes a lot of the arguments that have been referred to would also be some reading that would be of benefit to those who want some more insight into these issues. I just wanted to put that out there.
That's good. Yeah. That's good, man. If I can, you guys know I'm gonna push it, but I'm gonna respectfully say if I can push it. Dr. Hemmings brought up, the where do we go from here as a church, being the conscience based, our name, Conscience and Justice Council, made up of PARL directors from all across North American Division, Union, universities, etc. There's a little saying that says if you don't know your history, you're more than likely to repeat it. And so we hear stories, we read in history of how we as a church, whether it be Christianity or in particular Seventh-day Adventist Christianity, was silent during World War II, Germany. We hear about our silence during apartheid in South Africa. We hear of our silence, as was mentioned, during the civil rights era, even though Dr. King he himself was a pastor, and seemingly now during this one of the pandemics of racial unrest and January 6th, where you see Christian nationalism, Christians who are pushing for power and all of these things. Where should we be as a church when we see our own engaging in activity and mindsets that don't look that Christian? And this is for anyone. Where are we? Where do we go from here?
I think that condemnation needs to be swift and certain when we see people who take the name of Christ and do things like what happened on January 6th. One of the most famous, I guess, transgressors on January 6th was the person who styled himself as a shaman. I think he was from Arizona, and he had the face paint, and he had a Viking hat on his head.
We remember him.
When they broke into the well of the Senate, there was video of him actually standing there saying a prayer and asking Jesus to help the insurrectionists because the country was evil and had to be reclaimed for Christ.
Mm-hmm.
That sort of behavior cannot go unnoticed by Christians. We can't just gloss over anything like that. That sort of idea is packed with so much white supremacy, it's almost impossible to explain it all. This idea that America was a Christian nation and that America was founded as a Christian nation by white people for white people is an idea that has never left our consciousness. If I could just go back to what Dr. Hemming said, because what she said in her remarks is so profound. It is, and Dr. Miller will testify to this too. It is fashionable in legal circles to talk about how terrible the Dred Scott decision was, how awful it was for a Supreme Court justice to say that black people had no rights that whites were bound to respect, and that the country wasn't founded for them. And because the country wasn't founded for them, it's okay to treat Dred Scott like a piece of property and return him to his owner. And law professors and legal commentators today will take great pride and joy in saying that the Dred Scott decision has been overturned and that's not our legal doctrine anymore. But have our hearts changed? Have our minds changed? Do many people still not have a Dred Scott mentality in 2023? Do the insurrectionists on January 6th of 2021, do they not have a Dred Scott mentality? And will they not point to a few black faces in the crowd and say, oh, well, because he's with us, we're not racist? And they'll go around and they'll try to deflect and make all sorts of arguments. But in the end, I'm afraid that the letter of the law has changed, but the spirit has not changed. Hearts and minds have not changed. We are living supposedly in a legal sense in a post Dred Scott world, but socially we are very much living in a Dred Scott world. And until that changes, and to echo Olive Hemmings, her point is so profound. What role will the church play in changing hearts and minds, regardless of what public policy initiatives are pursued, which are important? I don't want to say that they're not, but in addition to that, if we have learned anything over all this time, it has to be what Dr. Hemmings pointed out, which is that we have to change our hearts and minds. And I think the question before all of us here tonight and in 2023 is, as she put it, how can we do that? How can the church do that? That's the work that has to be done.
But I think it's also important to recognize that the Dred Scott mentality no longer is black people are inferior and I'm better because I'm white. I would put it to you that 95% of the people that stormed the Capitol would deny very strongly thinking that way. And they would point to the few black faces in the crowd and say, see, we're equal. They don't have an overtly explicit ideology of racism. Now, maybe, implicitly and so on, you could argue that's there. But I think the Dred Scott mentality today is one of people need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. And if you're not doing as well as I am, or the middle classes or the upper middle classes, is because it's a character failure on your part. And the fact is that because of racism, because of slavery and racism, a disproportionate percentage of our community is a minority, of the poor part of the community is minority. And so when you go about saying poor people are there because of their own choices and their own fault, primarily, that becomes a proxy for saying Black people are getting what they deserve, right? So you can be effectively a racist without being explicitly a racist. And as this is what Martin Luther King was pointing out in this speech, right? That there's this underclass, there's this group of poor people that really you cannot blame for being there because of their history and the circumstances that have put them there. And as soon as we start saying everybody's where they are because of their own choices and their own responsibility, then we can shift. We can view ourselves as not being racist, but really it's become the cover of the new racism. And we have to, we don't want to do, of course, away with the concept of personal initiative and all of that, but we have to become much more conscious of the community and the web of relationships that create poverty, and the history of the racial animus that caused the existence of that web and that underclass today. And if we don't overtly oppose it, that we are then caught up in a kind of second tier racism, despite the fact that we don't view ourselves as racist at all.
I'd like to push you on that though, Nick.
Yeah, try.
Overt racism throughout the whole 2016 election cycle. It's just, in fact, just right up until 2020, right up until January 6, 2021, I saw overt racism. Maybe I'm wrong, but I see even signs of racist signs, and perhaps because Blacks were there, we didn't see, but there was a Confederate flag there. There were Nazi symbols there. I'm asking, why were those there? Why were so many white supremacist groups at the forefront of the protest on January 6th? What was going on? I'm asking. It's another rhetorical question. It's a real question.
And
it seems to be something more complex than that. Yes.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you, Olive, because the fact of the matter is the Trump presidency made an overtly racist appeal to disaffected white voters who felt troubled by the fact that they had to live in a country where the chief executive was an African American for the previous 8 years. If there was no President Obama, there would be no President Trump. And I think the Trump presidency was, in some sense, a racist backlash against Barack Obama. And what we saw in a series of microaggressions played out in the context of police brutality was a Dred Scott mentality toward African Americans that said that there are two criminal justice systems, one if you're white and one if you're African American. And the fact that if you polled people on January 6th, that they would deny that they were overtly racist, that doesn't mean, just because they deny it doesn't mean that's the case. I think you have to look at everything in context, and the manner in which Christianity was used as a pretext for overtly racist behavior. Think about what happened in the summer of 2020 in the wake of the George Floyd murder, when President Trump demanded his motorcade be pulled over to the side, and he stands in front of a church holding a Bible. Ironically, he was holding the Bible upside down. Now, this is a man who is probably transgressing every moral principle in the contents of the book that he's holding up, and he's holding up this book in the context of law and order. And in contrast, by the way, all of the military force that he was trying to marshal in the summer of 2020 was conspicuously absent on January 6th, 2021. I wonder if those had been Black Lives Matter protesters, if they would have been able to get anywhere near the Capitol, let alone breach it, get inside, defecate on representatives' desks, and kill police officers. on that day, caused the death of law enforcement. So I think the Dred Scott mentality, I agree with you, Nick, in some sense about second tier racism. I do think that's a very real thing. And I think there may be some whites who will obfuscate enough to hide behind that sort of mantle. But I also think that America is very much in need of a conscience makeover, that our internal understanding of the world has a long way to go.
I didn't think,
and we're very much still living with the Dred Scott mentality.
All right. Well, we got a question from the audience, but I know Lisa was trying to jump in a couple times.
Yeah, go ahead.
We want you to go first.
I don't think I have anything necessarily more to add. I mean, I think I was going to think about the bigger picture, which is I think part of what is going on with Dred Scott has to do with bodies. And I really think a whole lot of our power structures are organized in reference to particular bodies. And I think this happens in our church, whether we're talking about disability, gender, race, poverty, people in flesh. This is why people being colorblind isn't a thing, because we are enfleshed. You don't get to not know that I'm a woman, or that that I'm gendered a particular way, or that I'm a certain height, or whatever, a size. And we interpret people through the bodies that they are in. And the church, when you asked about like where do we go from here, and how, yes, we want public policy, how do we change hearts and minds? I don't know how to do it, and I'm part of a active church community, and I'd like to think about it in my local church. It's really hard not to replicate the world's power systems within our own church, where particular people are valued more than other people. And a lot of times those have to do with like the people that are doing well professionally, that are educated, men versus women, white people versus people of color, people born in the States versus immigrants. We are replicating people that have all of their bodily, what are perceived as not having disabilities, as opposed to people who have flesh disabilities. And I mean, the Lord does not want us to do this, but we replicate it in our church communities. And as I think about what I can do in my local church, this is part of what I'm thinking about. How can I hold up the people whose spiritual gifts and who are spiritual elders, but they are not maybe as highly educated or making as much money, or are in bodies that the world values around us, and that we are all taught over and over and over again are more valuable than others. And in the context of Dr. King Day, it's appropriate to talk about people who are racialized Black in our country and in our churches. But I'm also thinking about all these other things that are going on in the face of the other pandemic, all of those other ways we replicate those systems of power, and how challenging it is to resist that.
All right, let's jump back to the question, because you hit on it a little bit, but I want you to know that although it was hit on, we want to talk about that. And I think it's apropos to really talk about Ellen White and, Lisa and Nick in particular. I know you both have received backlash for actually advocating what our Adventist pioneers have actually said, because the church that we are today is not reflective of our Adventist pioneers. And this kind of hits at the question, what role did the church play to change hearts and minds during the days of Ellen White? It seems that this has been a problem for decades. How do you change hearts, especially for people in the church or art who feel their view is right? And, and how do we do that? Especially knowing our legacy, because, you go to Battle Creek and you see all this stuff in Adventist Village, and then you see what's happening, and, the world being replicated in the church. And our young people ask, what's going on? And when you hear people renouncing the church or renouncing Adventism, they're not renouncing their relationship with God, but they're renouncing the hypocrisy and the lack of racial sensitivity or even gender sensitivity that comes through the institution of the Adventist church, and which is a problem that's been for decades. It's recognized, but it just seems like we're just waiting for the next crisis, and so we can go back to what was going on, wait for the next crisis and go back, or we'll just pray about it and just hope it goes away. So in response to her question, what are your thoughts? Anybody?
Well, I feel like also we give in to the people with power too often. So what happened, when we think about Ellen White's son who came down on the boat and tried to like preach to both black and white audiences, and then that there was a lot of violence against that. So, Ellen White kind of says, okay, in order to like not cause more violence and backlash that would hurt the people in the audience, let's separate this. And I look at that and I think, wow, like what if we didn't do that? Like what if we were like, if you're going to be a Christian and you're going to give your heart to God, as a white person, you're going to need to be willing to live with, whose spirituality are we prioritizing? Were there a lot of Black Americans saying they weren't going to worship with white people? No, it was the white people saying that. And again, far be it from me, I wasn't in that situation. I understand that we make hard decisions, but it feels like the bullies we get into, we say, don't do that, it's going to cause too many problems. Well, for who? Whose feelings am I tiptoeing around?
Come on,
right?
Doc.
Like I'm telling you who I care about, who I'm not willing to offend. And so that's one of the ways I think that we know, we don't change hearts and minds if we're not willing to offend people who frankly are the bullies. Are we letting the bullies like determine the parameters?
And perhaps, Lisa, that is the root of the fact that this invective developed in the church called the social gospel. You are preaching the social gospel. That becomes an invective. Way back, it is time we realize that there's no such thing as the social gospel. The gospel is social. It is time we stop making this bifurcation between what we call secular and sacred. So, for example, if we're concerned, if we're out there in society advocating for the rights of people who are being disadvantaged in society, it should never, ever be seen as a secular affair. We should see it as an affair of the church, that we are concerned about human beings created in the image of God, whoever they are, whatever their race, their gender, their sexuality, whatever that they are, we are advocating for human beings created in the image of God. And therefore, these exercises should never be seen as secular. We tend to have these conservative ideas that protect the powerful, because I believe some of the so-called conservative ideas are simply ideas and dogmas that protect the powerful. And it's time we sort of deconstruct these understands of conservative, liberal, whatever, and begin to really look at the gospel as to what it really is about. What is the gospel? We tend to think the gospel can maybe defined as a body of doctrines that is based on the biblical interpretation of a particular denomination. We cannot define that as the gospel. We have to go to the scriptures. We have to go to Luke 4 and find out what the gospel is. And regardless of our denominations and our doctrinal positions, that gospel has to be preached as central to who we are. And we have to stop trying to protect the powerful, because that gospel does not protect the powerful. When we're willing to do that difficult work, then minds and consciousness will begin to shift towards something that is holistic and that is affirmative and that is life affirming of every person in society.
And I think after, just to follow up on Dr. Hemmings, after we go to Luke 4, where Jesus is reading about his own ministry in Isaiah 61, we need to go to Matthew 25. And we need to see that God is concerned about groups of people who are oppressed, that the face of one who is sick or one who is in prison and one who is hungry and one who is thirsty is the face of God himself. Because Jesus tells us in Matthew 25, except as ye have done it unto the least of these, you have not done it also unto me. So we have to, as Dr. Hemming said, we have to figure out a way to understand that a lot of these labels between secular and sacred are the products of these sort of embarrassing dichotomies of modern philosophy that emerge out of the scientific enlightenment that creates a secular world and a sacred world, and that causes a lot of people to relegate religion to the realm of private life, when the gospel is anything but that, as Dr. Hemmings pointed out. The gospel, it's time for dare I say, this word is anathema in some theological circles. It's time for a postmodern understanding of the gospel. It's time to call into question modernity's rigid characterizations of secular and sacred and see that the gospel is as all-encompassing as the God who it portrays. And unless we see that God in the face of other people who are downtrodden, who are oppressed, who are disadvantaged, we're just spinning our wheels.
Go ahead, Dr. Miller.
So that was powerfully stated, Tim, and I appreciate that very much. I just wanted to circle back around to Ellen White for a moment. You know, she took racism very seriously, and she didn't mince words about it. There's a quote that I'll paraphrase where she talks about that some people came into the church without a deep cleansing from the gospel that they needed, and they held on to their pro-slavery views. They need a deeper cleansing from the fountain of the gospel to leave these views behind. If you think about, that's pretty radical. She's talking about a social political position that they need to change when they become church members. And elsewhere, she made it clear those who didn't make this change, those who continued to support and defend slavery, need not be church members. Right? She did not make bones about this. She was clear this was going to be a standard of fellowship. Now, Lisa alluded to later on where she appeared to sort of make compromise with some segregated worship services, and I think we need to make clear there that wasn't just about not offending a certain group of people and maybe the more powerful people. This was about life and death. People were being lynched. People were being murdered. She didn't feel it was right to sacrifice or to risk the lives of Black worshipers and white worshipers at that point in time. For their very safety, they would choose this step of segregation. Now, she said, until the Lord can show us a better way, and clearly she was open to having integrated, she felt integrated services were the best. And when that became safely possible, we should have done it. And unfortunately, we got caught up in a conservative community that set that aside. And when she died, instead of following her lead to pursue a better way as we could, we got caught up in conservative politics and we didn't follow that lead. But if I may bring this thought to a conclusion by sort of recurring to my earlier remark that was challenged and fairly so. I don't want to go on be understood as saying there's no overt racism either in society or the church. There certainly is. But I know many people who voted for Donald Trump in our church, and none of them, all of them would object vociferously and strongly to harboring or holding any racist views regarding their Black brothers and sisters. They would simply deny it. They would not understand what you were saying if you called them racist. As long as you define racism as having overt ideologies of different values of racial types. But if you explain to them that racism is also something that is structural and implicit in a society, and that by not speaking against it, you actually act in a way that perpetuates the structural racism. So you can have an innocent mind, as it were, and they believe they do, but that innocent mind, if it's not put to overtly opposing structural racism, actually supports this racist structure. You're now going to have people that may listen to you about racism rather than merely dismissing you as not telling the truth about their subjective hearts and minds. And I think that's a very important step to take.
And Nick, that contributes to the answer to one of the questions that came up in the chat about how do we, when people don't want to address racism in the church. I think it's incumbent on people who are, especially those of us who are racialized white, to like lead the way in this. And I just wanted to tell one encouraging story that connects with what Olive said about how much Dr. Hemmings, my apologies, how dare I?
Yeah, please.
I respect, and I've read her books, so I respect that knowledge of our church's structure. But going back to the social gospel, one of my colleagues, Kevin Burton, who studies early Millerites and their anti-racism, he tells a story of how in 1844 there's a couple that he found who were advocating to end the laws in Massachusetts against mixed race marriage. It's not just anti-slavery, but anti-racist. They wanted to end the laws against mixed race marriage, and they were advocating and petitioning for this. In 1844, when they believed with all their heart, in June of 1844, they are working and trying to change the laws when they believe Jesus is coming in October of 1844. So even though they think the world is coming to an end, they still were working to end the systems of racism and oppression. And I think that's our legacy, that's our heritage. And we can believe Jesus is coming really soon, and yet we want to change the systems that we operate in.
One of the things about the speech, as he concludes, Dr. King, is a challenge of us not being satisfied. He challenges us that we should be dissatisfied until America will no longer have a high blood pressure of creeds and an anemia of deeds. He says, let us be dissatisfied until the tragic walls that separate the outer city of wealth and comfort from the inner city of poverty and despair shall be crushed by the battering rams of the forces of justice. Let us be dissatisfied until those who live on the outside of hope or outskirts of hope are brought into the metropolis of daily security. Let us be dissatisfied until slums are cast into the junk heaps of history and every family will live in a decent sanitary home. Let us be dissatisfied until the dark yesterdays of segregated schools will be transformed into the bright tomorrows of quality integrated education. Let us be dissatisfied until integration is not seen as a problem, but as an opportunity to participate in the beauty of diversity. Let us be dissatisfied until men and women, however Black they may be, will be judged on the basis of the content of their character, not on the basis of their color of their skin. Let us be dissatisfied. And so in conclusion, as we talk about this speech, what are your thoughts? We always want to give hope. We always want to inspire, even though we know change is necessary and change has not come quick enough or far enough, especially when it comes to our history. What are your final thoughts or concluding measures you would want to share as we talk to our audience today?
Before Edward Woods III, before they give their final thoughts, can you just put up on the screen Daniel's letter from Birmingham jail comments? They seem to go along precisely with what we were speaking about just now.
There's a lot of similarities between the letter from the Birmingham jail and this particular one. Yes. But as you know, we hooked up on the letter from the Birmingham jail last year.
Right, I know.
So, but definitely,
sure.
Comment for those who are seeing that is great, and we definitely want to show because it kind of highlights that. But this particular one is really talking about society, poverty, and as you know, this was the buildup to one of his last things that he was unable to do in terms of the Poor People's Campaign. But once again, getting back to our panelists, and thank you, Daniel, for those comments. What do we need to do now in terms of where we should be dissatisfied? So we as brothers and sisters in Christ, once again, brothers and sisters in Christ, someone also put up the text from Galatians that we are all one in Christ Jesus. What do we need to do to be satisfied in accomplishing that ideal that God has for us.
Not all at once.
Well, since I went last on the first round, maybe I'll go first on the last round.
There you go, Doc. There you go, Doc.
I've been inspired by a young scholar, Jamar Tisby, who wrote the book The Color of Compromise. Probably some of you have heard of him. He talked about compromise in the church. He has a blog, and he did a reflection on MLK's dream. He entitled it, "We Have the Words of King, but Not His Walk." Why does MLK's dream remain so elusive? Because his life was so hard, and effectively, we don't want to have harder lives. And I would slightly vary his title. We have the words of king. We have the ideals of king. Like who doesn't believe in I have a dream and we're all equal? But when you read this speech about where do we go from here, how many of us are willing to get down into the nitty-gritty of the social and economic policies that need changing and maybe learn to think about America in a different way than we've thought about it, in terms of it being great because of its free enterprise and its military and its ability for everyone to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. That is not a vision of America that leads to inequality. And I think the only way we begin to change that outlook is through personal engagement. I don't know, how else to do it. I was asked, I didn't necessarily seek it, but I'm the co-chair at the seminary at Andrews University of the Race and Justice Committee. And this semester, we're just going to be leading out in a book club to read books on this topic, because some of us are just we're highly educated in many things, but we're not so educated on this topic and what causes these racial inequities to persist. And we just have to bring knowledge where there is ignorance. And I've got to make a personal commitment, on top of all the things I'm doing in law and church and state, that this topic matters. And I'm going to spend some of my personal time in dialoguing with my colleagues on it. And I don't know, that's where it has to start, I think, in our own personal sphere of influence, and looking for opportunities to bring those truths into greater impact in our communities.
Okay.
That's good. Who wants to be next? Thank you, Doc.
I think we need to begin in the church a drive of social consciousness. And I'm not trying to restructure the church's proclamation or the, if I may use the word, the church's kerygma. I'm not trying to restructure it. But I'm saying that we need a drive of social consciousness, social education. Because sometimes people are just not aware, we're not aware of where we stand. We don't take time to think things through carefully. They are just these assumptions that we carry along, and we are not even conscious of these assumptions. And so it's as though we're an autopilot. And that is why, Nick, someone may not be aware of the extent to which they enable a systemic injustice, even though they might not think they're racist. And so this is what we need, this drive of social consciousness. Now, over the past 2 years, since 2022, Calvin Rock and Mervyn Warren have been editing a Black History Month study guide. I don't know if any of you got last year. You have this year. I think this is one great step in really building a certain social consciousness, and not seeing it as simply something social or secular, but seeing it as something that should be central Sabbath school lesson study guide. And this particular one, the contributors include Elbert Baker, Barry Black, Mark Woodson. I'm a contributor. And you have Keith Burton, Douglas Morgan, Leslie Pollard, and Ella Simmons as contributing editor. And I think Dr. Rock and Dr. Mervyn Warren, these were steps. They are going somewhere from here where they help to sensitize the Black community, and hopefully those who are willing in the white community, about social justice and issues as far as it is concerns Black people and other people who are. And this, if you haven't got, your church hasn't gotten it yet, all of you listening online, get this. It will generate a lot of discussion. So get this. It's available at Advent Source. Sorry, I'm using this forum.
Oh no, that's a good plug.
Word.
That is not shameless plug. That's a good plug. That is a good plug.
Yes.
We've encouraged all of our churches in our conference to use it. And I think it's education. That's what I've always said. Education. A lot of people don't know that Jesus, we're not to just look at his life, but we're supposed to live his life, like that quote that was put up, words of king, but not his walk. Dr. Lisa, Dr. Tim, closing remarks as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think every time I feel like it's cheating as a teacher, but I'm with Dr. Hemmings in that people don't know things. They just don't. And I forget what people don't know. And I realize, like, when I find out, I preach regularly. I'm preaching tomorrow, at church. And, I want to be steeped in scripture, and I tend to preach exegetically out of a passage. But part of me feels like when I find out what people don't know about our Adventist history, what they don't know about Black history, what they don't know about U.S. history, like fill in the blank, I feel like, well, I'm not doing my job, like my job, right in the corner where you are, where I am, And so I think that's what this kind of weekend gives us a chance to do that. We don't need to just talk about race or racism or inequities only on MLK weekend or during Black History Month or Women's History Month, obviously. But it does give us a chance to do that, to like tap into the fact that this is something we're doing. And so my goal and what I would hope for our communities is to take advantage of these opportunities for education. If you know something, say something, and we all have our own different contexts, that stuff that we know. Dr. Hemmings just said a couple words I don't know that I'm going to need to look up about the church that are, I guess, theological or Greek terms. But, we speak from the corner we're in. We talk about what we know. So if you know something, say something, I guess.
Good. Receive that. We received that. Dr. Tim.
Well, I want to conclude with a very unpopular view that we need to learn to abandon hope. We are too quick to resolve the suffering of our fellow human beings in an intellectual package in which we're able to explain suffering away without really addressing suffering. And what hope does when it is misunderstood is that it prevents us from tarrying with the other in his and her suffering. You cannot do the ministry required of Matthew 25 if you spend half of your time explaining why people are sick and why people are in prison. We call ourselves giving people hope when what we're really doing is trying to make ourselves better. We have a lesson to learn from Job's 3 friends, for when they first saw him from afar off, they just came with him, and the scripture says they tarried with him for 7 days and 7 nights, and no one said anything. But then they opened their mouths and they started theorizing, and they started saying things like, your children must have done something wrong. And in our contemporary language, we start saying, well, if you would just comply with the police officers, then you wouldn't have got shot. If you would only understand that if you don't do the wrong thing, you don't go to prison. No, I'm not going to visit you in prison. And we're so interested and committed to a project of self-righteousness and self-justification that we use hope in an almost toxic way to resolve the suffering of other people to make ourselves feel better. And until we get to the point where we learn to tarry with our brothers and sisters who are languishing in oppression until we learn to stop theorizing about their condition long enough to minister to them. We will be not with the sheep in Matthew 25. We will be with the goats. God have mercy.
Mercy.
Yeah.
Mercy.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are excited about this panel, and guess what? We want to see them again. It's not a matter of if, it's just when.
It's a win.
You can see they're preachers, they're scholars, but most importantly, they have heart. And we want to thank Dr. Olive Hemmings from Washington Adventist University, Dr. Lisa Clark Diller, who was mourning but still came on anyway, and then's going to preach the Billy Goat off the gospel tomorrow because she's fired up, and we wish her well. And I want to thank Dr. Timothy Golden and all the great stuff he's doing in Walla Walla and around, but also want to give a shout out to Nick Miller, our former Parle director, who has moved to D.C. but has been a phenomenal leader in Lake Union, a phenomenal leader in Lake Union that deserves to be recognized and applauded, because when you talk about these issues, Nick was the undisputed leader. It wasn't there was a group or anything like that. And as a result of him being the undisputed leader, in my opinion, he took unnecessary attacks of him and his character, which were very unfortunate. And we were glad as a part of Lake Region Conference to honor him for his service, for public affairs, religious liberty, making sure we had legal counsel for Sabbath accommodations, but also for making sure that he saw us, but wasn't afraid to tell others that only did he see us, but he understood us. And so, Nick, I just want to thank you publicly once again for your service to Lake Union and what you have done, especially to Lake Region Conference. And you are missed. I don't care about the emails and all you experience, because it's obvious that they haven't seen God. And the book is very, very clear about people who have seen God. And it's obvious that we have leaders, unfortunately, in our church, as well as members who haven't seen God because they remain silent when it comes to these matters. And so my hope and my joy and my prayer is that people will see Nick for his true, authentic soul in terms of what it means to be a Christian versus what it means to be a politician and hold on to your self-interest. So, Nick, thank you again. We appreciate what you have done. And I regret all that you experienced while you were here. But guess what? That's not how everybody feels about you. So God bless you, my brother, and much peace, much love to you and your family as you move on to as you are already in DC. But please know that you are loved and missed by people here as well in Lake Region, despite the detractors.
Love you too, Woody. God bless. Yeah.
All right.
Very kind.
We have a couple of announcements we're going to make before we pray with our panelists in the backstage, but we want to make sure we put up our announcements, and Pastor Josiah and I will go through those with you. We do have, I repeat, our Let Justice Roll Biblical Devotions on Conscience and Justice. It was done in sponsorship with the Conscience and Justice Council and Message Magazine. Hard copy and ebook available at Amazon, and an ebook available at the Apple Store. So once again, if you do not have your book, pick it up. You will see articles there biblically based, not politically based.
That's right.
Be clear, because people like to marginalize and ostracize and take away from the spiritual thing that God has called us to do, the biblical base with proper exegesis in these devotions on conscience and justice. Pastor Sai, anything you would like to share about that as we move on to the next announcement?
Yeah, I think this devotional book, for those who are asking how can we be educated, how can we learn more about justice and conscience, this is it right here, man. This devotional will share with you, and it will inspire you. I think somebody said that they were inspired in the chat. I think this will inspire us to recognize that we have a duty. not to just read about Jesus' life and read about the things in the Bible regarding justice and freeing those who are oppressed, but to inspire you to be filled with the Holy Spirit, so you can actually do what you read about. And I think everyone should get this devotional. It's a powerful devotional.
I want to remind everyone that tomorrow is the Religious Liberty Offering, January 14th, 2023. The theme is Liberty on Trial. We have an outstanding Liberty Magazine editor and Bettina Krause. And tomorrow, the offering that is raised is to help defend those who are having problems with Sabbath accommodations. Once again, Sabbath accommodation, or anyone that's having problems with religious liberty, whether it's Sabbath, Sunday, or Friday. We raise funds and we defend not just ourselves, but others. This is not a self-interest or a selfish ministry for Seventh-day Adventists, but for all people. And liberty's on trial, so your gift matters. We want to encourage people to give their religious liberty offering tomorrow, January 14th, to support our religious liberty, and especially those that are going for Sabbath accommodations. Once again, the religious liberty offering is tomorrow. And then we also want you to support the Liberty Magazine campaign at your local church. Get with your pastor or your public affairs and religious liberty leader at your local church, so that you can participate in the Liberty Magazine campaign, but more importantly, give an offering so we can assist those to worship according to the dictates of their conscience. Last but not least, Pastor Sai, if you can hit this last, you're good to go.
Absolutely, man. We want you to save the dates on your screen. Write it down. Remember it like it's your birthday. September 28th to October 1st. Our Conscience and Justice Council convention is going to be on the East Coast. This last year we were on the West Coast in Glendale, California. This year we will be on the East Coast in Maryland. And so we want everyone to pencil that in, save that particular date. Also, Reconstructing Religious Liberty in a Time of Religious and Secular Extremism, October 20 to 21st. Save that date as well. We're doing all we can. Edward was the third. We're doing all we can to inspire and educate our people to be all that God has called us to be. You know, we can't blame the church for not doing or not being, because we are the church. You know, we are a part of the body of Christ. And so, as one of my mentors always says, you know, we have to brighten the corner where we are. We have to be that agent of change, that disciple that God is calling us to be.
Well, may the Lord bless you and keep you, and may his face shine upon you and give you peace. Once again, we're here to celebrate MLK, but not to celebrate his words, but to walk the walk. God bless you, and we'll look forward to seeing you next month in February with our Black History Special, when we'll be on each and every Friday night. Look for the announcements each and every Friday night at 8 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time. God bless you, and have a good evening.